Absolutely, here is the complete story in one continuous narrative, with a cinematic emotional arc and a satisfying ending. The laughter stopped the moment the CEO walked across the crowded school reunion lawn, placed her hand gently on the single father's shoulder, and said, "He's with me." For a few seconds, nobody moved. The man who had once been the easiest target in the entire school stood there in an old suit that no longer fit perfectly, holding a paper cup of lemonade while former classmates stared at him as if he had somehow entered the wrong world. His former bully, Grant Holloway, was still smiling, but the confidence in that smile had begun to disappear. And standing beside the father was Celeste Whitmore, the powerful CEO whose company employed hundreds of people and whose name appeared regularly in business magazines. If you believe kindness can outlive cruelty, that people deserve second chances, and that hope can find us when we least expect it, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel so our community can continue sharing stories that remind us that a person's past does not have to determine their future. The man standing beside Celeste was Everett Callahan, and 20 years earlier, he had been the boy everyone expected to fail. Everett had been quiet, awkward, and painfully thin during high school. He wore the same 3 shirts repeatedly because his father had lost his job at a local factory and his mother worked 2 shifts to keep their small apartment. Everett rarely complained. He simply kept his head down, studied whenever he could, and dreamed of becoming an engineer. But dreams were easy targets for someone like Grant Holloway. Grant came from money, drove an expensive car before he was old enough to legally drink, and had a group of friends who followed him everywhere. He mocked Everett's clothes, his lunch, his stutter when he became nervous, and the cheap tools Everett carried in an old canvas bag because he loved repairing broken machines. Whenever Everett walked into the school workshop, Grant would find a reason to embarrass him. One afternoon, Grant had even taken Everett's homemade model engine, held it up in front of the class, and laughed that nobody would ever pay him to build anything because he could barely afford a pair of shoes. That humiliation stayed with Everett for years, but it never became the center of his life. After graduation, he attended a technical college on a scholarship, worked weekends repairing appliances, and slowly built a reputation for solving mechanical problems other people had given up on. His life still did not become easy. His mother passed away before seeing him graduate, his father eventually developed serious mobility problems, and Everett married young only to lose his wife after their relationship slowly collapsed under the pressure of financial hardship and exhaustion. What remained was his greatest responsibility and greatest blessing, his young daughter, Wren. Everett became a single father almost overnight, and every decision he made after that was about giving Wren the childhood he had never been able to have himself. He learned to braid her hair badly, packed lunches before sunrise, attended school plays with grease still under his fingernails, and sometimes repaired machinery for extra money after finishing his regular work. He did not have a large house or an expensive car. What he had was a daughter who believed her father could fix anything. By the time the 20th class reunion arrived, Everett almost decided not to attend. He had received the invitation several weeks earlier and kept it on the kitchen counter, untouched. Wren noticed it and asked why he had not replied. Everett told her there was no reason to go back to people who had already decided who he was. Wren, who was old enough to understand more than he realized, quietly reminded him that running away from old memories would not make them disappear. She told him that if someone had been cruel to him, that did not mean he had to become cruel too. Her words stayed with him. So on the morning of the reunion, Everett put on his best navy suit, borrowed a pair of polished shoes from a friend, checked his reflection in the mirror, and walked into the school grounds carrying 20 years of memories on his shoulders. The reunion was held outdoors on the beautifully landscaped grounds behind the old school building. White tables stood beneath large shade trees, soft music played from speakers, and former classmates gathered around photographs from their younger years. At first, Everett felt surprisingly calm. A few people recognized him and greeted him warmly. Some were genuinely happy to see him. Others looked at him for a second too long, trying to decide whether the quiet boy from the past had become successful or had simply survived. Everett smiled politely and kept moving. Then Grant saw him. Grant had aged well, at least on the surface. He wore a tailored suit, a luxury watch, and the confident expression of someone accustomed to being admired. He approached Everett with two former classmates beside him and immediately began making jokes about the old days. At first, Everett laughed politely. But Grant became bolder when he realized the attention was on him. He reminded everyone about Everett's old canvas tool bag. He joked about the model engine from the workshop and asked whether Everett was still fixing broken appliances in somebody's garage. Then he looked Everett up and down and said that some people never really move forward. A few people laughed nervously. Everett felt the familiar pressure in his chest, the same feeling he had experienced in the school hallway decades earlier. But he was no longer 17. He had a daughter waiting for him at home. He had survived things Grant knew nothing about. He simply took a breath and told Grant that he was doing fine. Grant apparently disliked the answer because it gave him nothing to attack. So he reached for something more personal. He made a careless remark about Everett being a single father and suggested that perhaps life had left him with no one else to choose from. That was when the atmosphere changed. Everett's face tightened, but before he could respond, someone behind Grant quietly said his name. It was Celeste Whitmore. She had been invited to the reunion because she was a major supporter of the school's technical scholarship program. Most people knew her as the CEO of Whitmore Dynamics, a company that had grown from a small engineering firm into a major manufacturer of industrial systems. What nobody at the reunion seemed to know was that Celeste had met Everett 6 years earlier under very different circumstances. At the time, one of her company's most expensive prototype systems had suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure. Several senior engineers had spent weeks trying to identify the cause. The company was losing money every day. Everett had been working as a maintenance contractor at the facility when he noticed something nobody else had considered. He stayed after his shift, studied the damaged components, and discovered that a tiny manufacturing flaw was causing a chain reaction through the entire system. His solution saved the company millions of dollars. Celeste had been the executive who personally reviewed his findings, and she had never forgotten the humility with which he presented them. Over the following years, Celeste had offered Everett opportunities to join her company permanently, but Everett always hesitated. He was responsible for Wren and wanted stability more than prestige. Eventually, he accepted a senior technical position that allowed him flexible hours and enough time to remain present in his daughter's life. He never used his connection to Celeste to impress anyone. He never talked about the projects he had helped complete or the trust she placed in him. To Everett, success was not something you announced. It was something you built quietly. Now, as Celeste approached, Grant straightened his jacket and immediately transformed his expression. He had recognized her. Everyone had. Conversation stopped across the lawn as people watched the CEO walk toward Everett. Celeste looked at Grant briefly, then at Everett, and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. She said that she had been looking for him because she wanted to introduce him to several important guests. Then she looked around the group and calmly added that Everett was with her. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything Everett had spent 20 years learning about himself. Grant's face went pale. He suddenly remembered the boy he had mocked, but now that boy was standing beside the woman whose company had recently won one of the largest industrial contracts in the region. Grant tried to recover by joking that he had only been teasing. Celeste did not raise her voice. She simply told him that teasing stopped being harmless when the person on the receiving end had spent years carrying the damage. The lawn became completely silent. Everett expected satisfaction. Instead, he felt something unexpected. Sadness. He looked at Grant and realized that the man standing in front of him was not the unstoppable king of the school corridors anymore. He was simply another aging man carrying his own mistakes. Everett could have humiliated him. He could have listed every cruel thing Grant had done. He could have enjoyed watching him lose face. But then he remembered Wren's words from that morning. Being hurt did not give him permission to become hurtful. Everett told Grant that he had spent years thinking forgiveness meant pretending the past had never happened. He had eventually learned that forgiveness meant refusing to let the past control his future. Grant stared at him, visibly shaken. He admitted that he had been cruel because he had been terrified of becoming ordinary. He had believed that if he could make someone else feel small, he would feel bigger. He confessed that he had remembered Everett many times over the years, especially after discovering how successful Everett had become, and that shame had made him avoid contacting him. Everett did not immediately forgive him. Instead, he told Grant that forgiveness was not something he could give simply because Grant had apologized in front of an audience. It would have to come from genuine change. Grant nodded. For the first time in 20 years, there was no arrogance in his expression. The reunion continued, but something fundamental had changed. People who had once ignored Everett began asking about his work, his daughter, and the projects he had completed. Everett answered honestly but without boasting. Celeste watched from nearby, proud not because Everett had finally proved the bullies wrong, but because he had become the kind of man who did not need revenge to know his worth. Later that afternoon, Everett stood near the old school workshop. The building looked smaller than he remembered. The windows were dusty, the walls were faded, and the workbenches still carried scratches from decades of students learning to build things. Celeste joined him there and told him that the school had asked her company to help renovate the technical program. She wanted Everett to oversee the scholarship and mentorship initiative for students who came from families that could not afford expensive equipment or private training. Everett stared at her in disbelief. She explained that she wanted young people like the boy he once was to have access to tools, guidance, and someone who would tell them that being poor did not mean being powerless. Everett felt tears gather in his eyes. For years, he had believed his greatest achievement was becoming successful despite everything that had happened to him. Now he understood that perhaps his greatest achievement would be helping someone else avoid believing they were worthless. Before leaving the reunion, Everett saw Grant standing alone near the entrance. Grant approached him slowly and apologized again, this time without an audience. He told Everett that he had been thinking about the workshop and the boy who used to carry that canvas bag. He admitted that he wished he had treated him differently. Everett looked at him for a long moment before offering his hand. He did not erase the past. He did not pretend the pain had never existed. But he decided that he would not carry hatred into the future. Several weeks later, Everett brought Wren to the school workshop. The renovation had begun, and new equipment sat beside old workbenches. Wren looked around with excitement and asked whether her father was really going to teach students there. Everett smiled and told her that he was going to try. She reminded him that he had always told her broken things could be repaired if someone was patient enough to understand why they broke. Everett looked at his daughter and realized she had unknowingly described his entire life. He had once been the boy everyone laughed at. Then he became the father who refused to let disappointment define him. And now he was becoming the mentor who could turn his pain into someone else's opportunity. As the afternoon sun poured through the workshop windows, Everett picked up an old metal component from one of the benches and placed it carefully beside the new equipment. The old and the new belonged together. Just like his past and his future. If this story touched your heart, leave a meaningful comment telling us what you believe Everett's greatest victory was: becoming successful, forgiving Grant, or choosing to help the next generation. Share this story with someone who needs hope today, because sometimes the person who was once made to feel small becomes the person who gives others the courage to stand tall. And if you believe in kindness, forgiveness, second chances, and the power of choosing a better future, please like this video, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Everett never became powerful because a CEO stood beside him. He became powerful long before that, on the days nobody applauded him, when he kept going despite being humiliated, when he worked while exhausted, when he raised his daughter with love, and when he chose not to become the kind of person who had once hurt him. The greatest answer to cruelty was never revenge. It was becoming someone cruelty could no longer define. And on that ordinary afternoon, surrounded by people who had once known him only as the boy with the cheap shoes and the old canvas bag, Everett finally understood something he wished he had known years earlier. Sometimes life does not give you the apology you deserve, but it gives you the chance to become the person you always deserved to be.